The Sterling Thorn Private Bank was not a place of commerce. It was a cathedral consecrated to capital. Its floors were vast, silent oceans of Italian marble, their polished surfaces gleaming like frozen rivers under the recessed lighting. The air itself felt expensive, thick with the scent of aged leather from the client armchairs and the faint, sterile whisper of a state-of-the-art climate control system. Sunlight filtered through immense floor-to-ceiling panes of armored glass, did not warm the space, but merely illuminated its cold, geometric perfection. It was a fortress of finance, designed to make the merely wealthy feel inadequate and the truly powerful feel at home. Into this hushed sanctuary of affluence walked a man who was an affront to its every principle. Elias Vance moved with a quiet hesitation, his worn boots making no sound on the marble. His coat was a frayed, colorless thing that had seen too many winters, and his trousers were clean but patched at the knee. His face, etched with lines of a sorrow too deep for his years, was framed by unkempt, silver-streaked hair. He clutched a simple, worn leather wallet in one hand, his knuckles white. He looked less like a client and more like a ghost who had wandered in from a forgotten, poorer world, a smudge of gray against a canvas of gold and steel. At the central teller station, encased in a fortress of polished mahogany and bulletproof glass, stood Marcus Thorne. Marcus was the living embodiment of the bank's ethos. His suit was a tailored masterpiece of charcoal gray, his silk tie knotted with a precision that bordered on surgical. A watch, with a face as complex as a celestial map, peeked from his cuff, its platinum case catching the light with a cold, knowing glint. His smile was a thin, practiced line, an instrument used for assessment rather than warmth. He surveyed the lobby not as a manager, but as a king surveying his court, his gaze flicking over the patrons, mentally calculating their net worth, sorting them into hierarchies of importance. His own value, he believed, was inextricably linked to the assets he managed. His soul was a ledger, and compassion was a liability he had written off long ago. Marcus's world was one of numbers and influence. He believed, with the fervor of a zealot, that a person's worth could be read in the crispness of their suit, the make of their car, the address on their statements. Money was not just power. It was a form of Darwinian proof, a signifier of inherent superiority. Those without it were not merely unfortunate. They were failures, genetic dead ends in the grand, ruthless race of life. He carried a private pain, a wound crusted over with the callus of wealth, but he never looked at it. Instead, he looked outward, his contempt for the poor a shield against the memory of his own past helplessness. Elias, standing hesitantly by the entrance, was everything Marcus despised, a visible reminder of weakness, of failure, of the world he had clawed his way out of. The object that would bind their fates, resting inside Elias's worn wallet, was a simple, unassuming bank card, a key to a secret that would shatter Marcus's cold, carefully constructed world. Elias took a deep breath, the sterile air feeling thin in his lungs, and began the long walk across the marble expanse toward the teller line. Each step felt amplified in the cathedral-like silence. He could feel the eyes on him, the subtle shifts in posture from the other clients, the way a woman in pearls clutched her handbag a little tighter. He was an anomaly, a disruption in the carefully curated atmosphere of prosperity. He was used to it. In the years since the world had fallen away, he had become an expert in being invisible, in being overlooked, in being judged and dismissed in a single, sweeping glance. He reached the velvet rope and waited. In front of him, a man was discussing a portfolio transfer in the hushed, confident tones of someone who measured time in fiscal quarters. Marcus listened with a deferential smile, his posture a study in practiced servitude to power. When the client was finished, he turned, his smile vanishing as his eyes landed on Elias. The shift was instantaneous. The warmth, however artificial, evaporated, replaced by a wall of ice. Marcus's eyes raked over Elias, from his scuffed boots to his frayed collar, and a verdict was reached in a fraction of a second. Contempt curled his lip, a subtle, almost imperceptible expression of disgust. "May I help you?" Marcus's voice was ice-wrapped in velvet, the politeness a thin veneer over a core of pure disdain. Elias stepped forward, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. "I would just like to check my balance, please." His voice was quiet, raspy from disuse but clear. He held out his simple, unadorned bank card. Marcus did not take it. He stared at the card as if it were a piece of refuse. A low, incredulous chuckle escaped his lips. It was not a sound of humor. It was a sound of derision, a weapon meant to wound. "Check your balance?" he repeated, pitching his voice just loud enough for the people nearby to hear. The lobby, already quiet, seemed to fall into a deeper hush. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A performance was about to begin, and Marcus was its gleeful conductor. "Sir," Marcus continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "this is Sterling Thorne Private Bank. Our clients maintain a minimum portfolio of $10 million. I think you may have taken a wrong turn. The Public Credit Union is 3 blocks east." A few of the onlookers snickered. Elias's face remained impassive, but a familiar ache bloomed in his chest. It was the ache of being misunderstood, of being rendered a caricature by someone who could not see past the surface. He had endured this 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways since he had chosen this life of quiet anonymity. "I believe I am in the right place," Elias said, his voice steady. This quiet defiance seemed to infuriate Marcus. It was an unexpected variable. The script required Elias to shuffle away in shame, tail between his legs. Instead, he stood his ground. Marcus's cruelty, fed by the attention of his audience, escalated. He decided to make this a lesson, a public execution of this man's dignity. "You believe you're in the right place," Marcus mocked, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "All right, let's play a little game." He leaned forward, his voice becoming a conspiratorial stage whisper that carried through the entire lobby. "What do you suppose is in there? $50? Maybe $100, saved up from whatever it is you do." He gestured vaguely at Elias's clothes. The humiliation was thick, palpable, a toxic cloud filling the opulent space. "I'll tell you what," Marcus declared, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "This is a slow afternoon. Let's make it interesting. I will personally wager my afternoon bonus, a tidy $5,000, that you do not have more than $1,000 in your account." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the challenge hang in the air. "But," he added, his smile widening into a predatory grin, "if by some miracle you have over $100,000 in that account, I will resign? On the spot? I'll walk out of this bank and never come back?" He leaned back, triumphant, folding his arms. The bet was absurd, the stakes impossibly high and designed to be utterly insulting. He had framed it so that either outcome would result in Elias's total humiliation. There was no conceivable way this man, this vagrant, could meet the condition. It was a joke, a cruel, public joke. The crowd watched, a mixture of morbid curiosity and detached amusement on their faces. They were spectators at a Roman circus, and Elias was the gladiator thrown to a lion. They waited for him to break, to flee. For a long moment, Elias simply looked at Marcus. He saw not just a cruel man, but a profoundly empty one. He saw the hollowness behind the expensive suit, the desperation in the arrogant posturing. He had sought peace in anonymity, but he realized in that moment that his silence had allowed men like Marcus to flourish, to poison the world with their casual cruelty. A quiet fire, long dormant, began to burn within him. It was not anger. It was resolve. He had endured enough. "Very well," Elias said, his voice no longer hesitant but imbued with a strange, resonant calm. He placed his bank card flat on the marble countertop. The challenge was accepted. A wave of surprised murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Marcus's smirk faltered for a barest fraction of a second, surprised by the man's audacity. But it returned almost instantly, broader and more contemptuous than before. The fool was actually calling his bluff. This would be even more amusing than he had imagined. "As you wish," Marcus sneered. He snatched the card from the counter with 2 fingers, as if afraid to touch it. He turned to his terminal, his movements exaggerated for the benefit of his audience. He made a show of wiping the card on his sleeve before inserting it into the reader. "Account number, ending in 8473, he announced loudly. "Let's see what vast fortune we have here." He typed with a flourish, his knuckles rapping dramatically on the keys. His eyes were fixed on the screen, a triumphant gleam in them, ready to read out a pathetic 2-digit number and claim his victory. The screen flickered. The account information loaded. And then Marcus froze. It was not a gradual change. It was a sudden, violent cessation of all movement, as if his nervous system had been severed from his brain. The smirk on his face did not fade. It was petrified, a grotesque mask of arrogance suddenly rendered meaningless. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin the waxy, bloodless color of old parchment. His eyes, fixed on the glowing numbers, widened in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The silence in the bank stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. The onlookers, sensing the shift, leaned forward. The air crackled with unspoken questions. What was on the screen? Marcus's hand, which had been resting on the keyboard, began to tremble. A single choked sound escaped his throat, a dry, rasping gasp. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to clear a hallucination from his vision, but the numbers remained. They burned on the screen, stark and irrefutable. He slowly, mechanically, lifted a finger and pressed the refresh key. The screen blinked. The numbers returned, unchanged. $100 million. The numbers were a judgment. They were a death sentence to his entire worldview. Each zero was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. This man, this shabby, invisible, worthless man, possessed a fortune that dwarfed the portfolios of nearly every client in the building. He was not a homeless man. He was a king in disguise. The power in the room, once concentrated entirely in Marcus's hands, did not just shift, it reversed with the force of a tidal wave. Suddenly, it was Marcus who was small, pathetic, and exposed. Elias, still standing in his worn coat, seemed to grow in stature. His quiet dignity was no longer a sign of weakness, but of immense, unshakable strength. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply watched the man who had tried to destroy him be consumed by the revelation of his own monumental ignorance. The laughter had died. The snickers were gone. The room was filled with a thick, profound silence. The silence of shock. A woman's hand flew to her mouth. The man who had been discussing his portfolio stared, his jaw slack. They were all witnesses, not to the humiliation of a poor man, but to the spectacular self-immolation of a rich one. Marcus Thorne, the man who measured all worth in dollars, had just been confronted with a sum that broke his mind. He had bet his career on an assumption, and that assumption had just been annihilated by 9 unforgiving digits. He was ruined, and the man who had ruined him simply stood there, waiting. From a glass-walled office overlooking the main floor, a figure rose from his desk. Arthur Harrison, the bank's senior regional director, had seen the entire exchange unfold on his security monitor. He was a man in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and eyes that had seen decades of market crashes and corporate takeovers. He was the wise arbiter, the true power in this building, and his face was a mask of cold fury. He strode out of his office, his expensive leather shoes making sharp, angry clicks on the marble floor. The sound cut through the stunned silence of the lobby like a judge's gavel. Every eye turned to him as he descended the grand staircase, his gaze fixed not on Elias, but on the frozen, waxen figure of Marcus Thorne. Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words were delivered in a low, controlled tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "Thorne," he said, the name snapping Marcus out of his trance. Marcus flinched as if struck. "Mr. Harrison, I can explain," Marcus stammered, his voice a pathetic croak. His composure was shattered, the fragments lying at his feet on the cold marble. "There is nothing to explain," Harrison said, his voice dangerously calm. He stopped directly in front of the teller station, creating a triangle of tension between himself, Marcus, and Elias. "I witnessed your disgraceful performance in its entirety. You used this institution as your personal stage for an act of petty, classless cruelty." Harrison then turned his gaze to the computer screen, which still displayed the staggering balance. He looked at it for a moment, then back at Marcus. "You publicly humiliated one of our most valued and most private clients. You wagered your position on a bet fueled by your own disgusting prejudice. A bet you have lost." Harrison's words were clipped, final. "Consider your resignation accepted, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Your personal effects will be mailed to you." It was an execution, swift and brutal. Marcus stared at him, his face a canvas of pure horror. "Mr. Harrison, please, You are a liability, Thorne," Harrison cut him off coldly. "A stain on the reputation of this bank. Now get out." 2 uniformed security guards, who had been watching from the wings, moved forward. They flanked Marcus, their presence silent but absolute. The public fallout had begun. Marcus's world, built on the fragile foundation of his position, was collapsing in real time. As the guards gently but firmly took Marcus by the arms, a young analyst in the back of the room, who had been discreetly recording the entire incident on his phone, quietly stopped the video and sent it to a friend who worked at a news blog. Within minutes, the story of the arrogant banker and the secret centimillionaire would begin its journey into the viral stratosphere. Marcus Thorne's name was about to become synonymous with spectacular, career-ending hubris. Harrison ignored the pathetic figure of Marcus being led away. He turned to Elias, his entire demeanor changing. The cold fury was replaced by a deep, professional deference. "Mr. Vance," Harrison said, his voice now filled with profound respect, On behalf of Sterling Thorne, I offer you our deepest, most sincere apologies. What you have just endured is inexcusable. Please allow me to escort you to my office. We will handle your transaction in private." Elias gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He retrieved his bank card from the counter and followed Harrison up the grand staircase, leaving behind a lobby full of shell-shocked millionaires who had just received a very expensive lesson in the folly of judging a book by its cover. As he walked, Elias felt no triumph, only a deep, resonant weariness. The money, as always, had solved nothing. It had only created more noise, more drama, in a life from which he craved only peace. The real reckoning, he knew, was yet to come. Days turned into a week. The video of Marcus Thorne's downfall became an internet phenomenon. It was dissected on news channels, debated in financial forums, and turned into 1,000 memes. Marcus was not just fired. He was excommunicated from the world of high finance. His name was blacklisted. The doors that had once opened for him with a reverential swing were now slammed shut in his face. He was a pariah, a walking cautionary tale. Stripped of his suit, his title, and his purpose, Marcus drifted through his now empty days in a state of shock. The contempt he had so freely dispensed upon others now turned inward, a corrosive acid eating away at his soul. But beneath the shame and the anger, a question gnawed at him. Who was Elias Vance? Why would a man with $100 million choose to live as a ghost? The question became an obsession, the only focal point in his ruined life. He finally found him, not through any financial database, but through sheer, desperate legwork. He found him in a place that was the antithesis of the Sterling Thorne Bank. A small, quiet park in a modest neighborhood, sitting on a simple wooden bench, staring at a playground where children laughed and played. Elias looked up as Marcus approached. He was not surprised. He seemed to have been expecting him. He gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him. Marcus sat down, the silence between them heavy and awkward. The crisp autumn air was filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of traffic. He was no longer the arrogant king of the bank. He was just a broken man, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, his face pale and unshaven. "I don't understand," Marcus began, his voice barely a whisper. "Why? With all that money? Why live like that?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He watched a young girl with bright red ribbons in her hair swing higher and higher, her laughter like tiny bells. A profound sadness flickered in his eyes. "That money," Elias said finally, his voice soft but heavy, "is not a blessing. It's a tombstone." He turned to look at Marcus, his gaze clear and penetrating. "My name is Elias Vance. I was a software architect. My wife, Clara, was a musician. We had a daughter, Lily. She had bright red ribbons she loved to wear in her hair." He gestured subtly toward the girl on the swing. Marcus felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "I designed a data compression algorithm," Elias continued, his voice becoming distant, as if reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "It changed everything in cloud storage. I sold the company. The number you saw on that screen, it's a fraction of the full amount. We were going to travel. We were going to build schools, start a foundation for the arts in Clara's name. We had 1,000 tomorrows planned." He paused, his throat working. The sound of the children's laughter seemed to mock the silence that followed. The day the deal closed, we went out to celebrate. A simple dinner. On the way home on a dark country road, a car came out of nowhere. Speeding, it hit us head on. Elias's voice broke just for a moment, but he mastered it. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. They were gone. Clara, Lily, both of them. He looked down at his hands, at the faint scars on his knuckles. The driver never stopped. A hit and run. They were never found. After that, the money was just paper. It was meaningless. It was an insult. It couldn't buy back a single second. So I walked away from it. I walked away from everything. I thought if I lived with nothing, I could somehow atone. For what, I don't know. For surviving. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. Marcus stared at him, the full weight of the man's tragedy crushing him. This was the man he had mocked, the life he had treated as a joke, a strange, cold dread, far worse than anything he had felt in the bank, began to creep up Marcus's spine. A dark, fragmented memory was stirring in the back of his mind, a memory he had buried for years under layers of ambition and expensive distractions. I am so sorry, Marcus whispered, the words feeling hollow and useless. But then, compelled by a force he didn't understand, a need to answer this man's terrible honesty with his own, he began to speak. My cruelty, Marcus said, his voice thick with a self-loathing that was new and terrifying. It comes from a place. I had a sister. Her name was Sarah. She was younger than me. She had a congenital heart defect. We were poor, dirt poor. My parents worked 3 jobs between them, but it was never enough. He stared unseeingly at the gravel path, lost in the past. She got sick, really sick. She needed a specialist, an operation we couldn't possibly afford. I watched her fade. I watched my parents' desperation. I felt so helpless, powerless. I came to believe money was the only thing that mattered. It was a god that could have saved her. Its absence was a devil that took her from us. The memory was surfacing now, sharp and painful, the final night, the frantic drive. The last night, Marcus's voice cracked. She had an attack. We had to get her to a hospital across the county, the only one with a pediatric cardiac unit that would even look at us without full insurance up front. I was driving. I was 17. I was terrified. I was speeding. It was raining. The road was dark. He stopped. His blood ran cold, a dark country road. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with a dawning, unspeakable horror. The pieces were connecting in his mind, forming a picture of such monstrous, cosmic irony that it stole the breath from his lungs. I hit something, Marcus whispered, the words tasting like ash. I didn't know what it was. A deer, I thought. I told myself it was a deer. I was so focused on getting Sarah to the hospital. I couldn't stop. I didn't stop. If I stopped, she would die. He was shaking now, his whole body trembling with the force of the revelation. They turned us away at the hospital anyway, he choked out, tears streaming down his face for the first time in 20 years. Not enough of a deposit. She died in the car on the way home. Elias stared at him, his face a mask of stone. The quiet park, the laughing children, the autumn leaves, it all faded away. There was only this man, this broken, weeping man, who had just confessed to being the architect of his apocalypse. The man he had humiliated was the man whose family he had destroyed. The man whose life he had ruined was the ghost who had haunted his every waking moment. Their tragedies were not separate. They were one, a single, brutal act of fate that had splintered, creating 2 different hells, only to bring them crashing back together on the cold marble floor of a bank 20 years later. The silence that fell between them was no longer awkward. It was the profound, abyssal silence of shared annihilation. The weight of the revelation settled over the park bench, a shroud of impossible grief. For a long time, neither man spoke. The sounds of the world, the children's laughter, the distant traffic, seemed to come from another planet. They were two castaways on a small, desolate island of shared tragedy. Elias felt a universe of emotions warring within him. There was the hot, blinding flash of rage he had suppressed for 2 decades. There was the cold, bottomless well of his sorrow, now given a face and a name. But beneath it all, something else stirred, something he had not felt in years. A flicker of connection. The man beside him was not just the monster who had killed his family. He was also a victim of the same cruel night. A boy who had lost his sister. A man warped by a grief that mirrored his own. Marcus, for his part, was completely undone. The carefully constructed edifice of his life, built on the cynical belief in money and power, had been leveled. He was left with nothing but the raw, agonizing truth of his actions. He was a killer. He was the cause of the very pain he had mocked. The irony was so profound, so cosmically cruel, it bordered on madness. He deserved every ounce of Elias's hatred. He deserved ruin. He deserved oblivion. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice raspy but clear. "All these years," he said, looking not at Marcus but at the empty swing set, "I have been a ghost, haunted by a phantom in a speeding car. And all these years, you have been a ghost too, haunted by a sister you couldn't save." Marcus could not look at him. He stared at his own hands, which were trembling uncontrollably. "I destroyed you," he whispered. "I took everything from you. And then I tried to take the last thing you had left, your dignity." "You did," Elias said, the words simple and true, devoid of accusation. They were just a statement of fact. A long silence passed. Then, slowly, Marcus lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollowed out, but for the first time, they held no arrogance, no contempt. They held only a vast, desolate landscape of remorse. "Then let me build something," Marcus said, the words tumbling out, desperate and raw. "Let me try to build something from the ruins. Your money, that tombstone, as you called it. Let's make it a foundation stone instead." Elias turned to him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Not for me," Marcus rushed to say, shaking his head vehemently. "I want nothing. I deserve nothing. But for them, for your wife, for your daughter, for my sister, for all the Sarahs and Lilies of the world whose parents can't afford to save them." The idea was born of pure desperation, a drowning man's gasp for a single breath of atonement. "You have the resources. I have the knowledge. I know how this world of money works. I know how to build things, how to manage portfolios, how to structure organizations. I can use the very skills I used for my own selfish gain. I can use them for this. We can build hospitals, fund research, pay for the surgeries for children whose families are poor and helpless, like mine was." He looked at Elias, his soul stripped bare. "Let me do this. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to build back a tiny fraction of the good I destroyed. Please. It won't be forgiveness. I don't ask for that. It can never be that. But let it be penance." Elias looked at the man before him. He saw the wreckage of a life, the profound agony of a soul that had finally been forced to look at itself. He saw a path, not a path back to what he had lost, that was gone forever, but a path forward, a way to transform the dead weight of his fortune into a living legacy, a way to give Clara and Lily's names a meaning beyond a date on a tombstone. His own grief had been a stagnant pool for 20 years. Marcus, in his desperate plea, was offering to help him turn it into a river, a current that could flow outward and bring life to others. It was a choice: remain a ghost on a park bench, or become an architect of hope. Slowly, deliberately, Elias Vance extended his hand. "All right, Marcus," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let's build something." Marcus stared at the outstretched hand as if it were a mirage. Then, with a choked sob, he took it. The handshake was not one of forgiveness or friendship. It was a contract, sealed in the crucible of their shared, unbearable pain. It was the beginning of the long, arduous path to redemption. In that moment, Elias Vance was not just vindicated, he was empowered, not by the money, but by the purpose he had finally found for it. And Marcus Thorne, stripped of everything he had ever valued, had just been given the only thing that could possibly save him: a second chance. 3 years passed. The seasons turned, washing over the city, changing the landscape of both the streets and the souls of the two men bound by tragedy. The viral video of Marcus Thorne's humiliation became a distant echo on the internet, a footnote in the ever-churning cycle of digital outrage. In its place, something far more tangible and enduring began to grow. The Vance Thorne Foundation was not announced with a splashy press conference. It began its work quietly, diligently. Guided by Marcus's ruthless financial acumen, now repurposed for charity, and fueled by Elias's near-limitless resources, the foundation started by paying off the medical debts of hundreds of families. It funded new wings in under-resourced hospitals. It established scholarships for aspiring pediatric doctors from low-income backgrounds. Marcus worked with a feverish, almost monastic devotion. He had traded his tailored suits for simple shirts and slacks. The cold platinum watch was gone, his wrist now bare. The arrogance had been burned out of him, replaced by a quiet, relentless intensity. He was often the first to arrive at their modest office and the last to leave, poring over grant proposals and financial projections. He was not just atoning, he was rebuilding himself, piece by painful piece from the ground up. He found more fulfillment in securing funding for a single child's heart surgery than he ever had in closing a billion-dollar merger. Elias, too, had transformed. The ghostly, haunted look in his eyes had receded, replaced by a clear, steady light. He was no longer hiding from the world. He became the public face of the foundation, though he remained a private man. He met with families, listened to their stories, and saw in their eyes the same fear and desperation his own parents-in-law must have felt. His work gave his sorrow a purpose, a shape. He was no longer just the man who had lost everything. He was the man who was using that loss to ensure others would not have to suffer the same. The culmination of their work was the Lily Vance Children's Hospital, a state-of-the-art facility built in the heart of one of the city's most underserved communities. It was a marvel of architecture and medicine, designed to be warm and welcoming, filled with light and color. Murals of whimsical forests and friendly animals, inspired by Clara's own artistic sketches, adorned the walls. The central atrium featured a playground with bright red swings. It was a place not of sickness, but of healing and hope. On the day of the hospital's dedication, a crisp autumn afternoon, much like the one when they had met in the park, a crowd had gathered. Community leaders, doctors, families who had been helped by the foundation, and the press were all present. Elias stood at a simple wooden podium, dressed not in a shabby coat, but in a well-fitting dark suit that spoke of quiet confidence rather than ostentatious wealth. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze calm and centered. A few rows back, standing humbly among the staff, was Marcus. He looked older, his hair now threaded with gray, but his face held a peace it had never known in his previous life. He was not seeking the spotlight. His work was his reward. "Thank you all for being here," Elias began, his voice clear and resonant, carrying over the assembled crowd. "When you lose someone, you learn that memory is a strange and powerful thing. It can be a prison, a place of shadow where you live forever in the past. For a long time, that is what it was for me." He paused, his eyes drifting for a moment to the hospital's gleaming entrance, over which the name Lily Vance was carved. "But I have learned that memory can also be a seed. If you plant it in the soil of compassion, if you water it with purpose, it can grow into something that offers shelter to others. This hospital is that shelter. It is built from the memory of a beloved daughter, a cherished wife, and a much-loved sister." As he said the last words, his eyes met Marcus's across the crowd. It was a brief, quiet acknowledgement of their shared journey, a testament to the unbreakable bond forged in the fires of their mutual tragedy. "We live in a world that often teaches us to measure worth in numbers," Elias continued, his voice gaining strength. "The numbers in a bank account, the figures on a stock ticker, the price tag on a suit. I am here to tell you that this is a lie. I once had a man challenge me, believing my worth was less than $1,000. He was wrong, but not for the reasons he thought. My true worth, and his, and the worth of every single person here, can never be captured by a balance sheet." He leaned forward slightly, his final words a summation of everything he had learned. "True worth is measured in kindness. It is measured in the dignity we afford one another. It is measured in the second chances we are willing to give and to receive. Wealth is not having a great deal of money. It is having something to give. Today, in the name of those we have lost, we give this place to you and to your children." He stepped back from the podium to a wave of heartfelt applause. The moral was clear, spoken not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet authority of lived experience. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through redemption. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the hospital grounds, Elias and Marcus stood together on a small balcony, looking down at the new playground. A little girl with bright red ribbons in her hair was being pushed on a swing by her father, her laughter echoing up to them, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "She reminds me of Lily," Elias said softly, a gentle smile touching his lips. It was a smile without pain. "She reminds me of Sarah," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time. Two men from different worlds, once predator and prey, now partners in a shared purpose. They had not erased the past. They had transformed it. The money that had once been a cold, heavy tombstone was now the foundation of 1,000 second chances, a living testament to the truth that the most profound connections are often forged in the deepest pain, and that the greatest wealth is found not in what one owns, but in what one chooses to build. The world had been made new, not by forgetting the tragedy, but by consecrating it to hope.